All right, here's my first attempt at a screencastify. I want to just quickly start off with a discussion of stuff we left off with in the 50s that go into the 60s. So again, you can see I'm in Schoology, and I am under Kennedy in the Cold War. I'm going to blow mine up a minute here. Now, as a reminder, I like talking about this political cartoon in class, normally as a group. But if you see, right, we have John F. Kennedy and another super important character, bald guy, a little bit more hair than me. Well, maybe I have a little more than him. Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union at this point as we get into the early 60s. Now, you'll also notice they're both arm wrestling with their opposite finger near a button, right, which leads down to the opposite atomic bomb, actually a hydrogen bomb. Now, as we get into the 60s, you can see the H on there. Maybe if I click on it, can I highlight it? No, I don't know what I can do. But anyway, right, these two are going to be engaged in this struggle, kind of who blinks first, right? Who has that? Lady Gaga, poker face? Poker face kind of a game here. So if you scroll down, if you're following along with me, Kennedy's plan going into the Cold War as he takes over in the early 1960s is this thing called flexible response, right? He still wants to fight communism using containment, keep it where it is, but he wants to have options, which will be important as we get into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he wants to have a conventional military buildup, nuclear arsenal, and also be willing to use other alternatives to fight the spread of communism, including diplomacy and blockades that we'll see coming up. And so flexible response is kind of Kennedy's plan to deal with the Soviet Union and communism. So a couple things we'll look at, right? Cuba will be a main player, as we'll see. We'll talk about this thing with a weird name called the Bay of Pigs. And then the big issue for the early 60s is going to be the Cuban Missile Crisis. There's actually some parallels between maybe how people feel now and how people felt during the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis. And then we'll also talk about first, actually, this Berlin crisis. And again, we talked about the Berlin airlift, if you remember that, and the Berlin blockade from the 50s. And Berlin's always a hot spot in terms of tension between East and West, communism and democracy. So first of all, before I go into the Berlin side of things, how does Cuba come into the mix? Well, Cuba had a leader, who you can see in this picture, who's cozying up with this individual, which hopefully you recognize from the political cartoon, Khrushchev, the leader of Russia. The bearded man here is the leader of the Cubans, and his name is Fidel Castro. And we become super suspicious, and rightfully so, as we'll see, because of a move we make, that Cuba is becoming cozier and tighter with the Russians, which is, for us, worst case scenario, right? If I scroll back up, you can see the southern tip of Florida, right? Keys, Miami down here on the southern tip. I mean, Cuba is right off the tip of Florida. And so that's a threat. If they're going to be a communist ally with the Soviet Union, that would be a problem that is an example of containment, again, not working. Right? So we don't want communism and Russia's friends kind of on our doorstep. And so really that'll be the Cuban dilemma as we go into the late 50s and into the 60s. And so Kennedy decides he's going to agree with the CIA, and they're going to do this activity called the Bay of Pigs. And that's just the bay they infiltrate. But anyway, we're going to send in 1,400 Cuban exiles, right? Cubans that had left Cuba. We're going to train them. We're going to send in our Air Force first and take out some strategic sites. And then hopefully these Cuban exiles can go in and overthrow Fidel Castro. Okay, it's a disaster. Some of the airstrikes miss. We do not take out Castro from power. And we actually have to pay the Cubans, you can see down here on your screen, $53 million to get the exiles back. So it's a disaster. Right, makes the U.S. look bad. Why are we picking on little Cuba? And Cuba's response and Fidel's response will be to cozy on up with the Russians even more. They feel like they need a friend, right, with the big bad U.S. sitting up above them to the north. And so it's really the worst possible outcome for us. It's not what we intended to happen. We wanted to put